It was one of those early autumn mornings when the air had just begun to lose the oppressive weight of summer, and a crispness hinted at the coming chill. The town of Copper Ridge, nestled between pine-laden hills and winding country roads, had always prided itself on being quiet, a place where everyone knew everyone, at least on the surface. I'd lived here all my life, grew up fishing in Lake Westwood, got into my fair share of trouble as a kid, and eventually made my way through the academy to become sheriff of the very town that raised me. After a decade wearing the badge, I knew one thing for certain. Trouble doesn't always come from the outsiders. Sometimes, it's the ones who've lived next door for years, the ones who think they own the place. That's how I first started butting heads with Diane Whitmore, the self-appointed queen of the local HOA. She wasn't just your typical busybody. She ruled our neighborhood like a dictator with a clipboard, enforcing her own interpretation of the bylaws with the fervor of someone who had long since forgotten the point of community. For the most part, I ignored her. My job was dealing with real crimes, drug busts, missing persons, domestic disputes, not whether someone's mailbox was an inch too tall or if their lawn was 3 days overdue for a trim. But Diane had a way of making herself a problem for anyone who didn't fall in line. And lately, I'd found myself at the top of her list. It started small. Passive-aggressive notices about my driveway being too cracked for HOA standards. Fines for unauthorized modifications because I installed a security camera after a string of break-ins. Then, just last week, she had the audacity to issue me a citation for excessive vehicle presence in my own driveway because my patrol car was parked there when I was off duty. I could have ignored it, but there was something about Diane that rubbed me the wrong way. Maybe it was the way she treated people, especially the elderly and single parents in our neighborhood, like peasants beneath her rule. Maybe it was because, deep down, she enjoyed exerting control over others in a way that felt less about order and more about power. Then, the final straw came. Last night, I got home late from a particularly long shift dealing with an armed robbery at the gas station. I barely had time to set my keys down when I heard voices outside my house. I stepped onto my porch, still in uniform, and there she was, Diane, along with 2 other HOA board members, standing in my yard with flashlights like they were about to conduct a raid. "Diane," I said, my patience wearing thin, "what exactly are you doing on my property?" She gave me that tight-lipped smile, the one she used when she thought she had the upper hand. "Sheriff Carter, I'm afraid this has gone too far. You were given multiple citations regarding your property's violations, and since you failed to comply, the HOA has no choice but to escalate the matter." Escalate? I folded my arms, glancing at the 2 men standing behind her, older, nervous-looking, clearly uncomfortable. "You do realize this is private property, right? Not when it falls under the HOA's jurisdiction." She adjusted the silk scarf around her neck, as if she were discussing fine dining reservations instead of trespassing. "As of tonight, the HOA has voted to initiate proceedings for forced compliance. If necessary, we will take legal action." I felt my jaw tighten. I had seen Diane go after plenty of people before, slapping them with outrageous fines, threatening liens on their homes, even pushing families to move just to escape her tyranny. But this was personal. "You're going to take legal action against the sheriff?" I asked, incredulous. She blinked, her smug expression faltering for just a second before she recovered. "Your position doesn't put you above the rules, Carter." "No, but the law sure as hell puts me above whatever power trip you think you're on." Her face darkened, but she wasn't done. "We'll see about that. If you continue to defy the HOA, there will be consequences." I could feel the warning in her words, but I wasn't about to back down. I had seen plenty of bullies in my line of work, ones with guns, ones with money, ones with power. Diane Whitmore thought she was the queen of this town, but she had no idea who she was messing with. That night, I made a decision. Enough was enough. I was going to put an end to Diane's reign over this neighborhood, once and for all. What I didn't know was just how far she was willing to go to keep her grip on power. And that soon, she'd be the one crossing a line she could never come back from. The morning after my confrontation with Diane, I found a bright red violation notice taped to my front door. Final warning. Non-compliance will result in enforcement action. The audacity of it made my blood simmer. Enforcement action? What was she going to do to my house? Fine me for breathing? I balled up the paper and tossed it onto the porch table. This wasn't about HOA rules anymore. This was about control. Diane had spent years terrorizing this neighborhood with petty citations and intimidation tactics. But now, she had her sights set on me, and I wasn't about to roll over. But as much as I wanted to storm over to her house and put an end to this nonsense, I knew I had to be smarter. Diane thrived on twisting the rules to suit her needs. If I gave her a reason to paint me as the aggressor, she'd use it. Instead, I spent my lunch break at the county clerk's office, digging into HOA records. What I found was interesting. Diane's position as HOA president wasn't exactly legitimate. The last official election had been over 6 years ago. Since then, she had postponed elections due to various unforeseen circumstances, keeping herself in power through loopholes and manipulation. I also found records of excessive fines she had imposed, ones that weren't within the HOA's legal authority. If I could prove this, I could get her removed. That was my plan. Keep it clean, keep it legal. But Diane had other ideas. It started with my patrol car. I found it keyed from fender to taillight, the deep scratches deliberate, almost angry. A childish act of retaliation, but one that pissed me off nonetheless. Next came the anonymous complaints, noise violations, suspicious activity, reported at my home while I was on shift, claims that I had been harassing HOA members. My boss, Chief Dalton, called me into his office to ask what the hell was going on. "Carter, I don't care about your personal beef with some neighborhood Karen," he said, rubbing his temples. "But I've got 3 complaints in 2 days, and the mayor's asking why one of my officers is causing a stir in a damn HOA. You think I'm causing a stir?" I asked, incredulous. Diane Whitmore is weaponizing the HOA against half the neighborhood. She's been harassing me for weeks, and now she's trying to make me look like the problem. Dalton sighed. "I get it, but do yourself a favor, de-escalate. I don't need a PR nightmare because you're in a pissing match with some power-hungry board president. De-escalate." I knew he was right. The last thing I needed was for Diane to twist this into a professional misconduct issue. But every part of me hated backing down from bully. I decided to fight smart. I started gathering statements from neighbors who had been wronged by Diane. Mrs. Alvarez, an elderly widow, told me Diane had threatened to have her property liened over an unpaid fine she never even received a notice for. Mark and Lisa Thompson, a young couple with 2 kids, showed me a stack of citations Diane had issued them in the last 6 months. Everything from improperly stored trash bins to excessive lawn decorations. I compiled it all. The fines, the fraudulent leadership, the abuse of power. It was enough to make a case. But then, Diane escalated again. One night, I returned home late and found my porch light smashed. My security camera was yanked off its mount, dangling by a wire. That was the final straw. I checked the footage. The camera had cut out just before midnight, but not before capturing a figure in the shadows, short, stocky, with a familiar stiff posture. Diane. That was breaking and entering. Vandalism. Harassment. I had her. Or so I thought. The next day, I knocked on Diane's door, badge visible on my belt. She answered with an exaggerated sigh, as if I were the one inconveniencing her. "Sheriff Carter," she said, arms crossed. "To what do I owe this visit?" I held up my phone, playing the short clip of her lurking outside my house. "Care to explain what you were doing on my property last night?" Her expression barely flickered. "Oh, please. That could be anyone. You were trespassing, and you damaged my property." She smirked. "Do you have proof that I did that? Because if not, I'd be careful throwing around accusations. You wouldn't want people thinking you're abusing your position." She had no shame, no fear. She knew exactly how to manipulate situations to her advantage. "Diane, this ends now," I said. "I know about the fraudulent fines, the illegal citations. You're running this HOA like a dictatorship, and I'm putting an end to it." Her smirk faded. For the first time, I saw something else in her eyes. Not fear, but calculation. "You think you can take me down?" she asked, voice low. "I am this neighborhood. You want to fight me? Fine, but you better be ready for war." Then, she slammed the door in my face. I should have seen it coming. I should have known she wasn't done. Because that night, Diane took things to a level I never expected. And this time, it wasn't just property damage. It was life or death. The air was heavy that night, thick with the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the open case file I had built against Diane. It was solid, statements from harassed homeowners, records of her fraudulent fines, even a few under-the-table fees she had pocketed. This was enough to have her removed from the HOA, maybe even enough for criminal charges. But something gnawed at me. Diane wasn't the type to go down quietly. She had backed me into a corner before, but this time, she was the one against the ropes. And I knew damn well people like her didn't surrender. They escalated. A sudden rustling outside snapped me out of my thoughts. I stood, instincts kicking in, hand hovering over the grip of my holstered gun. My porch light was still busted, but the street lamp cast just enough of a glow for me to see movement in my yard. Then, a metallic clink. A shadow darted across my lawn. My pulse spiked. I moved quickly, opening the front door, just in time to hear the unmistakable hiss of a gas valve being turned. Near my truck, my patrol car. I stepped out and caught a figure crouched near the rear tire, a small canister in their hand. "Hey," I barked. The figure whirled around, Diane. But what stopped me cold wasn't her presence. It was the gun in her hand, leveled directly at my chest. A .38 snub-nose. She wasn't just vandalizing my property. She was prepared to kill me. For a split second, neither of us moved. Then she smiled. That same smug, self-satisfied smirk she always wore when she thought she had the upper hand. "You just couldn't leave well enough alone, could you?" she said, voice eerily calm. I kept my hands where she could see them, careful not to make any sudden moves. "Diane, put the gun down. You don't want to do this." Her finger twitched near the trigger. "Oh, but I do, Sheriff. You see, you made this personal. You thought you could humiliate me, take everything I built, and just walk away." She scoffed. No, I don't lose." I shifted slightly, testing her reaction. The gun didn't waver. She was steady, which meant she wasn't just bluffing. "Diane, if you pull that trigger, there's no coming back from this." Her expression darkened. "Maybe for you." Then she exhaled, as if resigning herself to a decision. I saw it happen before she even moved, the tightening of her grip, the slight pull of her wrist. She was about to fire. I dropped low just as a shot rang out. The bullet tore into the wood siding behind me. I rolled, drawing my own weapon in one smooth motion. "Drop the gun," I roared. For the first time, I saw it, panic in her eyes. She hadn't expected me to react so fast. She stumbled back, raising the gun again, but I was already moving. In 2 strides, I closed the distance, knocking the weapon from her hand with a swift strike to her wrist. It clattered to the pavement. Diane let out a strangled scream and swung wildly at me, nails clawing. I caught her wrist, twisting her arm behind her back. "Let me go," she shrieked, thrashing like a wild animal. Not a chance. I wrenched her forward, pressing her against the hood of my truck as I reached for my cuffs. And then, the HOA board members arrived. At least 6 of them, some still in their pajamas, drawn out by the gunshot. "What the hell is going on?" One of them, Mr. Hewitt, stammered. Diane's voice turned shrill. "He attacked me. This man is insane. He tried to." "Shut up, Diane," I snapped, yanking her upright. "You just tried to kill me." Murmurs rippled through the small crowd. Then I spotted Mark Thompson. He looked at the gas canister still sitting near my patrol car, realization dawning. "She was going to set it on fire," he breathed. "Oh my God." The others followed his gaze, their horror spreading like wildfire. And just like that, Diane's reign ended. Not in triumph, not in control, but in absolute disgrace. I turned to the crowd, speaking loud enough for them all to hear. "Diane Whitmore is under arrest for attempted murder, arson, and destruction of property." Silence. Then a single voice. "Mrs. Alvarez." About damn time. The tension cracked. People exhaled, shaking their heads, some looking sick, others relieved. I clicked the cuffs onto Diane's wrists, pulling her toward my patrol car. She twisted to glare at the onlookers, but her usual condescension had crumbled into desperation. "You need me," she screamed. "This neighborhood will fall apart without me." No one answered, because they all knew the truth. It had already been falling apart, because of her. I shoved her into the back seat, slammed the door shut, and let out a slow breath. It was over. The flashing red and blue lights painted the street in rhythmic pulses as I watched Diane sit hunched in the back of my patrol car, her head bowed in furious silence. The neighborhood stood in stunned quiet, residents whispering among themselves. Some held their robes tightly around their shoulders. Others had arms crossed, as if shielding themselves from the weight of what had just happened. Then, slowly, as if a collective realization was sinking in, a shift occurred. Mrs. Alvarez was the first to step forward. "You have no idea how long we've been waiting for this," she said, voice trembling, not from fear, but relief. Mark Thompson nodded, arms wrapped around his wife. "She had us all afraid to speak up. We should have done this sooner." I met his gaze. "She had power because she made you believe you were alone. But you weren't. None of you were." Hewitt, one of the HOA board members, let out a long, shaky breath. "Carter, what happens now?" I glanced at Diane through the cruiser's window. "She's facing serious charges: attempted arson, attempted murder, destruction of property. I'll be filing a full report with the DA in the morning." His expression tightened. "And the HOA?" I gave him a pointed look. "That's up to you. But I'd suggest holding actual elections this time." I got a few chuckles. Tired ones. Worn ones. But they were real. And, just like that, the spell Diane had cast over the neighborhood was broken. By the time I finished my official report at the station, it was close to sunrise. The weight of the night pressed down on me as I locked up my files. It was done. Diane was booked, processed, and awaiting formal charges. Chief Dalton leaned against the doorway to my office, arms crossed. "Hell of a night, Carter." I let out a tired chuckle. "Yeah, not how I planned to spend my evening." He studied me for a moment. "You good?" I exhaled, rubbing my face. "Yeah, just can't believe how far she was willing to go." I knew she was bad news, but I didn't think she'd actually pull a gun on me. Dalton nodded, his expression unreadable. Then he clapped me on the shoulder. "You did good, and you handled it by the book. I'll make sure the mayor knows this wasn't your mess. It was hers." "Appreciate it, Chief." He turned to leave, but paused. "You heading home?" "Yeah, after I grab some coffee strong enough to keep a corpse awake." Dalton chuckled. "Get some rest, Sheriff." By mid-afternoon, the fallout had begun. Diane's arrest was the talk of the town. News spread fast, faster than I expected. People came forward with stories of her bullying, intimidation tactics, and shady dealings. The HOA board announced an emergency meeting to dissolve her leadership and conduct a full audit of the organization. It turned out Diane had been siphoning money from HOA fees for years, padding her own pockets while slapping homeowners with bogus fines. There was talk of civil lawsuits, but I stayed out of it. My part was done. A few days later, I was back at home, finally able to sit on my porch without worrying about some manufactured violation or sudden enforcement action. My new security cameras were installed, my porch light replaced, and for the first time in weeks, the neighborhood felt different. Calmer. Free. Mrs. Alvarez came by with a plate of homemade empanadas. "Figured you could use a good meal," she said, setting it down on my table. "You must be exhausted after dealing with that lunatic." I chuckled. "You have no idea." She sat down across from me, watching the street. The air felt lighter. The oppressive weight of Diane's presence finally lifted. "You know," she said after a moment, "I think you reminded us we're not just people living next to each other. We're a community." And we let her take that away. I nodded, taking a bite of an empanada. "Damn, they were good." "Well, I'd say it's about time you all took it back." She smiled. "That's exactly what we're going to do." As she stood to leave, she hesitated. "We're having a block party this weekend. First one in years. You should come." I raised an eyebrow. "A party? After all this?" She smirked. "We got a lot to celebrate." I laughed. "I'll think about it." As she walked away, I leaned back in my chair, stretching my legs out. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. Diane had spent years ruling with fear. But in the end, fear wasn't enough to save her. And now, the neighborhood was finally hers no longer. A week had passed since Diane's arrest, but the echoes of her downfall still rippled through the neighborhood. I saw it in the way people carried themselves, shoulders no longer hunched in quiet submission. Conversations held freely on sidewalks where, before, they might have been whispered behind closed doors. I had lived in this community for years, but it wasn't until Diane was gone that I realized how much we had lost. Fear is a quiet thing. It creeps in, little by little, until it becomes normal. Until you stop questioning why you feel tense in your own home, why you dread stepping outside. Diane had ruled through intimidation, making people believe they were alone. And for too long, they had accepted it. I had accepted it. That was what stayed with me the most. Not that Diane had the gall to pull a gun on me. Not even that she had nearly gotten away with it. What haunted me was how close she had come to winning. If she had been just a little more careful, a little less arrogant, she could have continued her rule. People would have kept their heads down. Maybe in time, I would have done the same. Not out of fear, but out of exhaustion. Because fighting people like her takes work. And it's so much easier to just let things be. But the thing about people like Diane is that they don't stop. Give them an inch, and they take the whole damn neighborhood. I sat on my porch, watching the sunset bleed gold and violet across the sky. The sounds of laughter drifted from a few houses down, where kids played freely in their yards. Someone was grilling, probably Thompson, judging by the smell of charcoal and hickory. The block party was in full swing, and I could hear the distant buzz of conversation, the hum of a community reclaiming itself. I wasn't much of a party guy, never had been. But this one felt different. This wasn't just a gathering. It was a statement. Diane had tried to divide them, tried to make them weak. But now, they were stronger than ever. I exhaled, feeling a tension in my chest finally unravel. For the first time in a long time, I belonged here. Not just as a sheriff. As a neighbor. As part of something worth protecting. With a final glance at the gathering down the street, I stood, stretched, and grabbed my keys. Maybe I'd swing by after all.